Yep.
Okay, great. Well, as Xander mentioned, I'm going to be talking to you all today about some work that we've been doing at ERI on community wildfire protection plans. Xander talked a little bit about it, but ERI serves diverse audiences with objective science and implementation strategies to support ecological restoration and climate adaptation on Western forest landscapes. We are best known for our ecological science, but we're expanding our work into the social, economic, and policy barriers to forest restoration. And so that's my area. My title is Human Dimension Specialist, which is sort of a way of saying social science, but I do a lot of other stuff beyond just science research. So today I'm going to be talking to you about a project that we've been working on in coordination with Arizona Department of Forestry and Fire Management. So I'll be using a couple acronyms. That one is DFFM, so that's the Department of Forestry and Fire Management in Arizona, assessing the effectiveness of Community Wildfire Protection Plans, or CWPPs, with a focus in Arizona and then a little bit into the Western United States. So we developed this project in coordination with DFFM, and I'll explain some of the logic behind that in a little bit. Just a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about today. We have a lot of detail that we've gathered throughout the course of this project. So what I'll be giving you today is kind of a broad 30,000 foot overview of sort of the range of information and results that we've gathered. The project will be wrapping up in December of this year, so stay tuned for the final report. And really the main goal of this project was to help develop recommendations for DFFM specifically, but that could also be relevant to other Western states. So I'll start by giving some context and background on the project. I'll give a quick overview of the study goals and methods. Then I'll summarize key results from Arizona and then our west-wide look and end with recommendations and some time for discussion. All right, so I'll just start with a little bit of context on what CWPPs are and where they come from. This is just a picture of the 2010 Schultz fire near Flagstaff, Arizona. So I'm sure I don't need to explain to folks on the line, but you know, forests and ecosystems are experiencing these uncharacteristic fires, but of course, so are the human communities that are intermixed within these ecosystems. Because fires are such complex socio and ecological problems, it's really important that we begin to better understand how to plan across those socio-ecological systems. You know, like we've seen these fires in California where there's this huge range of capacity for human communities to plan for, respond to, and recover from fires. And CWPPs are designed to do just that. But I think in the last few years, there's been some general consensus that they're not necessarily always meeting those objectives and helping communities become more adapted to fire. Furthermore, in the last few years, we've seen a lot of different management approaches that talk about this idea that Xander mentioned earlier too about, you know, we know that ecological processes affect the landscape scale, but planning at a landscape scale isn't always as easy as it sounds. So in recent years, we've seen these concepts to advance landscape scale planning, or working across jurisdictional boundaries. There's this general concept of all lands management, which is that, you know, management affects landscapes and we need common goals across jurisdictional boundaries. And I'm arguing here that CWPPs are actually some of a building block of some of these strategies that have come in more recent years. So we also have the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy. That's a multi-agency collaboration to address wildland fire. It's got three main tenets: restoring and maintaining landscapes, fire adapted communities, that's where CWPPs fit, and making sure that there's safe and effective response to fire. And then in the last year or so, we've also seen the Forest Service promote this idea of shared stewardship, which is resulting in working with states to prioritize doing the right work in the right place at the right time. So these are just a couple examples. We also have things like Good Neighbor Authority, Firewise plans. There are a lot of different collaborative planning mechanisms that address fire. But CWPPs are somewhat of a building block of some of these frameworks and came about before some of them. So where did they come from? So in 2003, we had the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, which was passed under the Bush administration. It was a little bit controversial for reasons I won't get into now, but it has had a lasting impact on community wildfire planning. One thing that HFRA, or the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, created were Community Wildfire Protection Plans. They're defined and described under Title I of HFRA. And in summary, what they are, what CWPPs are a mechanism for communities to consider how they want to plan for, respond to, and recover from wildfires. A CWPP is a document that a community at risk from wildfire can develop to identify and prioritize areas for hazardous fuels reduction and other actions that can help reduce their wildfire risk. And very importantly, communities that have CWPPs are typically rated as a higher priority for many state and federal funding initiatives that provide resources for fire risk reduction. So one of the things about HFRA is that it's relatively vague, and the Title I that defines CWPPs, it's relatively vague in terms of direction, but it does have three key tenets, which include that CWPPs must be developed collaboratively. So that includes participation from key parties at federal, state, and local community levels. CWPPs must include some description of prioritized fuel reduction. So really communities or a CWPP area must go through some kind of risk assessment process and prioritization to understand how they want to reduce hazardous fuels. And then finally, CWPPs must also address how to treat structural ignitability, so sort of at the homeowner or structural level. And so in looking at CWPPs over the years, other folks have sort of described the brilliance of HFRA as its vagueness, or that it's open-ended and allows for local communities to develop plans that fit their local needs. But it's been more than 15 years now since HFRA was passed, and I think we've seen a wide range of responses to HFRA and CWPPs, and so that lack of clear direction in HFRA may not always result in a clarity on the ground. So I just want to, and I'll get into a little more detail into the range of CWPPs here just in a sec, but I wanted to share this graphic, which is from the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network. So this is not mine, but I really like it because it shows that there's this whole constellation of things that go into developing communities, excuse me, communities that are adapted to fire. We've got landscape treatments, community engagement, health, wildfire recovery, response, safety and evacuation, and then of course plans and regulations. So CWPPs fit over here in the plans and regulations, along with things like WUI codes and ordinances, spatial fire planning. But I want to sort of, the point I want to make here is that they're part of this bigger constellation of planning that goes into creating a fire adapted community. So as I mentioned before, because HFRA is relatively open-ended, there has been a wide range of responses to developing these plans. Over the years, there have been some guidance that has been developed to assist communities who are developing CWPPs. So various handbooks have come out over the years that provide recommendations for steps to take, and those have been very helpful. But nonetheless, we've seen the plans take a variety of forms across the West. Jesse Abrams and some other folks did a survey of CWPPs a few years ago, and it was really interesting. They found that the plans ranged in size from 9 pages to 339 pages. We've seen that the number of collaborators on the plans ranged from as few as about 3 or so to more than 10. And again, that I think it's really important to note that with community wildfire planning, that adapting plans to fit the local context is very important. That's a finding that we see again and again in fire social science, but at the same time, the lack of clarity can also be difficult for communities. So let me get into the study that we did here. I'm just going to give you a very brief summary of our study design. Again, we were very focused on applied information that Arizona Department of Forestry and Fire Management could use to help improve how they are managing CWPPs. And this is just a photo from the post-2019 museum fire near Flagstaff. Okay, so about a little over 2 years ago, we met with DFFM to discuss some direction and decided that with respect to CWPPs, especially in Arizona, there's really a need to determine some best practices and recommendations for effectively preparing, updating or revising and implementing these plans. And DFFM really wanted to take a hard look at how things are working in Arizona and then look outside of Arizona to see what other Western states are doing and use that to inform improving the way they're working with CWPPs here in Arizona. So we developed this project in consultation, close consultation with DFFM. It involved kind of 6 main elements. The first was that we really needed to do a census of plans in Arizona and see where they were with respect to whether they'd been updated, whether they're had moved from community to county scale. And so we worked with DFFM and other partners to get a comprehensive list and contact information for everybody on CWPPs in Arizona. The next thing we did was develop a survey that was administered online to all of the fire districts and departments and other key collaborators to gather information about all of the Arizona CWPPs. So the way that this survey was structured was that folks had to answer questions related to one CWPP. So if they had participated and worked on more than one, they were supposed to pick the one that they felt the most familiar with and then answer the questions related to plan development, implementation, and effectiveness specific to a single plan. Next, we did interviews with DFFM staff and key partners. These were open-ended interviews on the phone and in person to just get a sense of how the state agency was really viewing CWPPs and also how some key partners were viewing them. The next thing that we did was worked to develop a survey that was sent out to state forestry departments in the other 17 Western states. That survey was sent via our state forester in Arizona out to other state forestry departments. So we really wanted to just get input as to how CWPP programs are managed in other Western states. We didn't try to survey communities across the 17 Western states. We were really focused on plan management. We also did some follow-up interviews with folks in Arizona, and then finally ended with focus groups with 5 select Arizona CWPP areas to help validate the results that we developed through the online survey and the interviews, and then the survey of other Western states. And so those focus groups were with 5 select areas, including the Flagstaff CWPP, the Mojave County CWPP, the Yavapai County, Cochise County CWPPs, and then also one in Santa Cruz County, which doesn't have a countywide CWPP. All right, so I'm going to focus now on some of the results in Arizona. So I want to start with giving you an overview of the plans in Arizona. So this map, we have 2 different colors here. And this encompasses all of the plans from 2004 to 2018. We didn't see any plans until 2004 because HIFRA was passed in 2003. The first plans really came out in 2004. So the solid blue color are sub-county scale CWPPs in Arizona. And then the hatched color are county scale, so full county scale CWPPs. So you can see that there's, at this point in 2019, well, up to 2018, which is the same now for 2019, but we have nearly complete coverage across the state with the exception of, a larger area in northern Arizona, which is a large part of that is tribal land. And then Santa Cruz County, in the very southern part of the state, does not have a countywide CWPP, but they are looking at developing one. Okay. I'm going to go back briefly. One thing I wanted to note is that there are 30 unique plans in Arizona. 13 of those are at the count, or 9 of those are, are at the full county scale. And there are 13 counties in Arizona, so nearly all of those are covered. But I do want to note that Arizona's counties are quite geographically large. For example, Coconino County in northern Arizona is approximately the same size as the state of Rhode Island, compared to New Mexico, which has 33 counties. So I just want to point that out in this slide. Okay, so what I wanted to do here is look at overall effort in CWPPs over the years. So this graph shows new plans and updates per year. We have a couple different colors here. So the orange color are new county scale CWPPs. The purple color are updated county scale CWPPs, so plans that went through a formal update process. The blue color are community scale CWPPs, and then the brownish color are updated community scale CWPPs. So when we saw our first plans in Arizona in 2004, we saw quite a few that were developed at the community or sub-county scale. We only had one plan, and that was Yavapai County that was developed at the county scale. But over time, what we've seen is that there's fewer total plans being worked on each year in Arizona, but there's been a shift from the sub-county scale, the blue color, to the county scale, the orange. So we're seeing this sort of overall change from a focus on community scale planning to CWPPs at the county scale. Again, like I said, there are a couple of exceptions. Not all of the counties in Arizona are covered. And then notably in 2014, we had a new community scale plan, and that was the Groom Creek plan that was within the Yavapai County area. All right, so these are some responses from the Arizona survey of CWPPs, but we asked folks, what is your preferred geographic size for a CWPP? And so what we have here in this graph are the percentages, and then on the bottom we've got the sort of geographic scope. So clearly the most preferred are the multiple communities, and so that could be something like a couple similar communities in a region, but that's followed closely by county scale is preferred. We've got some other, which would include like a fire district boundary or other sort of smaller jurisdictional boundaries, but overall we see a preference for these larger scale CWPPs. We also asked folks, how is your CWPP capturing the needs of the geographic area it encompasses? Overall, folks felt that their CWPP was indeed capturing the needs of their geographic area. Although a quarter of respondents from the Arizona survey were not super thrilled, but I think overall we're seeing that folks felt satisfied with the size of their CWPP, at least in that result. And I'll talk about some tension in the data that we see a little bit later on here. So in Arizona, I think we tend to see two main CWPP scales. We have these county scale CWPPs, which tend to be developed or led by consultants or consulting companies hired to help develop the plan. They're sometimes a little bit less specific in detail and recommendations, but often more robust in terms of the way that they identify wildfire risk and priority treatment areas. So I've just pulled an example from the Pinal County CWPP, so you can see a robust GIS analysis was used here to develop an assessment of risk in that area. Then on the other hand, we have these sub-county scale CWPPs. In Arizona, these tend to be the older plans that were developed shortly after HFRA was passed in 2004. At that time, many of them tended to be led by more local community representatives. They were sometimes more specific in recommendations because they were a smaller scale, simply because they were a smaller scale. And then they were often using more qualitative assessments of risk. So I just sort of circled and showed that, you know, that's a way of describing risk that uses text rather than maps. So this is just kind of some general trends that I think we've seen in Arizona. When we dig into the interview data with respect to CWPP scale, I think that's when this tension starts to emerge between the preference that people have for scale. Just so folks that aren't familiar, this is a word cloud, this image here, and that just shows the terms that came out most in the interviews. So the ones that are bigger were used more in the interview data. So you just can kind of get a sense of how people are talking about this concept. And these two quotes here I thought were relatively illustrative of this tension in the data about CWPP scale. So the first one, I think smaller scale CWPPs have an opportunity to be more effective in identifying specific treatments. On the other hand, a counterpoint to that would be, I think a CWPP should be at the county level. I don't think communities need to be standalone, fend for yourself kind of thing. It takes a lot of money and man hours to develop these plans. And so again, just mentioning that there's this tension between specificity and the amount of work required to plan at small scales. And it's unclear, you know, what planning level CWPPs are really meeting at this point. But I think folks in the interviews also really recognize that there's trade-offs between scales as well. So just wrapping up on this idea of CWPP scale, in the interviews with agency folks, a lot of folks were really talking about an idea of multiple scale tiered planning. And what that would mean is you may have a plan at the county scale that covers all of the communities, but then there are options for communities within a county to develop somewhat of a more enhanced plan that maybe has more of that detail, that specificity that folks are interested in. But when I talked with folks in the communities, they were concerned about that idea and the capacity that might be required to manage tiered CWPPs. So there's still some sort of questions that need to be explored in that concept. I mentioned this briefly earlier, but there are lots of other types of plans that look at wildfire risk. We have county hazard mitigation plans, which are at the county scale. We have fire-wise plans, which are often at the neighborhood scale. We have things like forest plans. Now we're seeing shared stewardship agreements, which are being developed at the state scale. But the thing is these plans are often, you know, they may reference each other, but they're typically not working together in a concerted way. And so one of the things that was really clear in the Arizona interview data was that, you know, there's concern that there's so many planning documents in place and many of them get developed and then just sit on a shelf gathering dust. So I'm referencing this quote here at the bottom. So the biggest challenge is really to come up with a tool that can be useful to emergency responders and planners. So now I'm just going to give you a quick overview of some of the detail that we have from the Arizona survey on the different elements of CWPPs. So we focused on scale. Now I'm going to turn to the elements of the plans themselves. So with respect to developing the plans, so the planning process, I just wanted to highlight a few things. In Arizona, we've seen that the majority of plans take 1 to 2 years to complete. When I say majority, I'm saying greater than half of the interview respondents indicated that it took more than one to 2 years to complete the plan. The formal signature process can take up to 1 year, and I'll get into a little more detail on that later. And then most respondents preferred to see updates every 4 to 5 years. So once a plan's completed, after about 5 years, it needs to be updated. The majority of CWPPs in Arizona were developed with assistance from sort of an external contractor, and most respondents felt that the contractors are effective. CWPP planning processes are often open to the public, but I'm sure this will not come as much of a surprise. Almost everyone indicated that even though they are open to the public participation is typically very limited. With respect to CWPP funding in Arizona, the majority of CWPPs have been used to apply for funding for hazardous fuels reduction. Most hazardous fuel reduction grants require a CWPP. The grants range considerably in funding entity and amount. I won't get into detail in those today. And then 74% of respondents who said their CWPP had been used to apply for funding said that the funding was obtained. So the presence of a CWPP is assisting in getting funding for CWPP implementation. And most respondents said that the funding was used for fuels reduction, protection of critical infrastructure, and community outreach. In terms of the plans, the content of the plans themselves, they all generally meet the key requirements of HFRA, so develop collaboratively, identify fuel treatments, and structural ignitability issues. Beyond that, they vary widely in terms of their content. Well, some vary widely, others are more similar, but they typically have a wide range of methods used to identify fuel treatment priorities And then there's typically limited tracking of whether priority areas are treated as a result of CWPP being completed. Most CWPPs include some kind of an implementation plan, but it's typically pretty generic. There's less common are having implementation coordinators or budgets. And then few CWPPs include a post-fire recovery plan, though many of them reference county hazard mitigation plans for that. In terms of implementation of CWPPs in Arizona, most respondents said that CWPPs drive decision-making about fuels treatments, but when asked for examples, most of them were sort of about grants. Many respondents said CWPPs are too vague to guide implementation effectively, but that their existence allows for communities to get grants. But then again, where that money is used may not always be clear or tied directly to something identified in the CWPP, so that's difficult to track. A few respondents said accomplishments were tracked or monitored, and then many respondents said that a wildfire did occur in their plan area after it was completed, but less than half knew if a fire had burned through a treatment that had been done as a result of the CWPP. So getting into effectiveness in Arizona, generally speaking, many respondents said CWPPs do not have a clear purpose, but they are largely being used to obtain funding. At the same time, respondents also felt that their CWPP development was more effective than other wildfire planning efforts that they had participated in. So I did, there was sometimes this sense of, oh, well, CWPP is just a checkbox for a grant. At the same time, we hear people saying, well, that's great. Like, we're getting money to do fuels treatments. We're collaborating. And so I definitely heard both ends of the spectrum. What I'm gonna do here is just run quickly through some of the top cited benefits and limitations. In our Arizona survey, I used the existing literature on CWPPs to create selection choices for these results that I'm gonna be sharing with you, just to kind of validate what we're hearing as far as benefits and limitations in Arizona. So the top 5 benefits from the Arizona survey: the CWPP increases community capacity, it helps identify new resources, it helps create new social networks, develop new skills, and then expand existing social networks. The top factors that contribute to CWPP success: the presence of existing relationships is number 1, creating a shared understanding of wildfire risk reduction, a shared understanding of wildfire risk itself, sustained communication, and shared willingness to take action. So a lot of sort of shared understanding was a big theme in Arizona. Factors that limit CWPP success: lack of funding, that was a big deal that came out a lot. Lack of political support, lack of community involvement. We already kind of talked about how the public is not as involved as folks may like them to be. Lack of time for planning and lack of time for implementation. Time and money are always big barriers that we hear about. So in terms of what facilitates an effective CWPP in Arizona, more funding, no surprise. Folks also wanted to see better access to agency expertise. People were interested in CWPP templates that create sort of a general footprint that all plans can follow. And then we also folks wanted better access to technical and scientific expertise, especially with the prioritization of risk, and then guidance in Arizona that's specific to Arizona. Again, resources lacking for CWPPs: lack of funding, lack of community involvement, capacity to manage grants, easy to access GIS information, and getting all the resources together in a workable document. So next, I'll just briefly summarize some of our results from the other Western states. Sorry, taking a drink. This data is actually going to be updated because what it's showing are the raw number of CWPPs in Arizona compared with survey responses to the most common CWPP scale in other Western states. So we're working on updating this, but you can kind of see that the general trend: Arizona is this brown color, the purple color are other Western states. The typical scale that we're seeing for plans in those two categories. The general trend is that we're seeing more county scale plans in other Western states than we are in Arizona, but as I mentioned earlier, a number of those sub-county scale plans in Arizona are old and need to be updated. And also that the geographic scale of many other Western states, the counties are smaller than they are in Arizona. So one thing, DFFM in Arizona was really curious with respect to this survey of other Western states, how other states are managing their CWPP programs and how they can improve their processes with respect to CWPP. So that was why this survey was directed at other state forestry departments. And so we'll focus on sort of management of plans from those entities. The majority of other Western states have formal programs for managing CWPPs that are typically run by agency staff. Only 10% of respondents said consultants were used. Nearly half of respondents said that their state formally evaluates CWPPs in some ways. And I just gave some examples of evaluation metrics here, of course, meeting federal guidelines, completing the required plan elements, measurable, specific, achievable goals, inclusion of an action plan, appropriate collaborators involved, community-based map of risk, and county adoption of plans. So that's assuming it's a county scale plan. Also in other Western states, we are seeing that most of them require that CWPPs meet certain minimum requirements, which they state, and that they contain specific elements. So some of the most common required CWPP requirements, nearly all of the top 5 are related to signatures. So applicable local government, local fire department, state forester, and then other participating entity signatures, and then of course that the plan meets the required plan elements. Sorry, I've been talking a lot this week, so I'm losing my voice. The most commonly required elements that other Western states are requiring for their CWPPs: identified points of contact for each plan. That's a big deal. Who can you reach out to talk about the plan? In Arizona, it was somewhat hard to always find who was the key contact. Of course, prioritize treatment areas, that's required under HFRA. Reporting of accomplishments was important, that was a big deal. Some sort of implementation schedule, and then of course, use of wildfire risk assessment model. In terms of themes regarding effectiveness of CWPPs from other Western states, we see that the benefits that folks are citing are, of course, helping assist in fuels reduction, identifying risk, and then the development of the plan itself. And funding, of course, is always brought up, but that being a benefit of the CWPP process. Counterpoint to that, lack of funding is a limitation. Lack of a clear leader, especially with respect to implementing the plan. It's easy for plans to get outdated, and again, this idea of there's limited community interest. So what constitutes an effective CWPP? The process of doing it, the collaborative process, action-oriented plans that have very clear requirements, a plan that has community buy-in, and then of course a plan that is funded. So just a few recommendations from other Western states, and then I'll move into the recommendations from Arizona. The top one, and this relates to some of the, what constitutes an effective CWPP, but really ensure ongoing collaboration. Emphasize the why of the plan. Why are we developing it? Keep plan design simple. I heard that a lot. Simple is better. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. Use lessons learned from other plans and inform your process from what's worked in the past. And then of course, finding and developing consistent funding sources. So I just wanted to bring up a couple illustrative quotes from other Western states. Folks said, make sure you have someone to coordinate and carry out next steps, make sure everyone is involved moving forward, and make sure there is money available to do so. So really, keeping that collaboration going after the plan is completed. And then here, do not complete CWPP for the sake of funding eligibility only. I added the only. As they will become old and unused, complete them with measurable goals in mind that can assess fire threat and aid communities through actionable tasks. So a lot of what folks said worked is, be action oriented. So for me, this really, looking at the data from Arizona and other Western states, I brought this up that we're really seeing this tension with respect to scale. But I think there are a couple questions that come to mind that need to be answered with respect to CWPPs, and this is sort of a thought exercise. But it became clear to me throughout this process that in looking at the data, that the purpose of a CWPP isn't necessarily clear. And what I mean by that, is it a high-level guiding document that can be accessed at the county scale, or is it a tool to really identify specific prioritized projects in detail? And then similarly, who is the audience for a CWPP? Is it the interagency collaborators? And again, that's related to scale. Are those the interagency collaborators at a county scale, or is it really the local community? Say our fire departments or our general public. And fire departments and districts are kind of in between. They can fall in the category of interagency collaborator or more of the local community. But we're seeing that there's this tension between these two sort of functions. And I think it's important to note that, as we all know, action happens at the community scale. We need planning at multiple scales, and the challenge is really lining up those scales. So finally, I'll end with some recommendations for effective CWPPs. These were developed through our focus groups, our sort of validation process and follow-up interviews, as well as ongoing discussion with DFFM. So these are just some of the key themes that we addressed in these CWPP focus groups. And the point of these focus groups was really to say, here's what we've been hearing from these surveys and interviews. And what do you all think? That was sort of my community level validation. And we talked about, I won't be able to get into detail on all of these things, but these are things that are going to be brought up in our final report. Everything from the purpose and the use that people saw to the plan, to who should be holding the plans, where should the repository be, what kind of signature process makes sense, how should community groups be involved, and so on. And another thing that was really important that we discussed in these Arizona focus groups were, and one thing that Arizona Department of Forestry and Fire Management is exploring is the creation of standard elements for Arizona CWPPs, or a template of some kind for Arizona CWPPs. And so I asked all the focus groups what they thought the key elements of a CWPP should be. So across those groups, we saw that all plans should have some kind of statement of why. Why does this plan exist? Who is it serving? And identify the audience as well. Of course, and most of the plans already do this, some assessment of the current conditions of the landscape. We should, of course, include fire risk assessment and prioritization. A lot of people were interested in a story map element that could be accessed by the public. Plans should include proposed actions and constraints. I heard a lot of people asking for photos with examples, so visual accompaniments. There should also be sort of documentation and tracking of past accomplishments. So what projects were completed, again, with visuals, before and after pictures can kind of be, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And then benchmarking and monitoring information, and an outreach plan. How is that CWPP going to get out to the public? And then finally, some of the optional items people were talking about were summaries of plan sections, roadmap for the community, evacuation plans, things like resources and funding options, key contacts, and a glossary of terms. So I'll just end with some recommendations. I'm just about done here, but this is a repetition of what I've already been saying, but I think, from this work and looking at CWPPs in Arizona and then across the West, I think what we really see is that there's a need to really identify the audience for a CWPP. So we're seeing plans at the county scale, plans at the community scale, and plans that work well seem to have a clearly identified audience. Who's this plan for and why? Similarly, the intended purpose and use of the plan should be clearly stated somewhere. Many of the plans have an intended purpose and use, but it's not always outlined in an explicit way. And then, of course, the scale of the plan should then match that intended audience and purpose. There's no right scale. Clearly, county scale plans have a lot of benefits in terms of providing cover to all communities, but there's the trade-off that you may not have as much public participation when the planning is at that scale. I think it's important that CWPPs explicitly be tied to other types of plans, like our forest plans, fire-wise plans, shared stewardship agreements, county hazard mitigation plans, and work together in concert. It would be great if states, and of course state capacity ranges as well, but it's great if states can provide some assistance or at least direction in terms of what wildfire risk assessment or prioritization tools to use. And then identifying minimum plan requirements as well is also really important. So finally, with respect to sort of wrapping it all up, in terms of fire adapted communities and what makes a fire adapted community, we see again and again that local context matters. And so it's important not to sort of provide too much for a CWPP. You know, guidance should be flexible enough to allow a plan to adapt to its local community context and allow that local community to inform the plan. At the same time, you know, having some minimum requirements, sort of a template or suggestions that communities can follow will be really helpful. Folks often cited collaboration as the biggest benefit of these plans. And then again, I think they should really align with other initiatives and priorities that we're seeing, such as shared stewardship. So with that, I will wrap up and look forward to discussion and feedback and questions.
That was great, Melanie. Really interesting to see both the in-depth view of Arizona and also kind of connect it with what's happening across the West. So we had some good conversation in the chat window about Oregon and different approaches to this scale issue. Let's see, I think I'll let folks read that chat for themselves. I'm not sure if there's a specific question in there we want to bring out. Obviously, David or Eitan or Victoria, if you want to sort of ask a question of Dr. Colavito, that you can reform that in the chat window there. And while we're waiting for other questions to come through, I might ask whether you saw any use of or growing use of post-fire planning in CWPPs. This is an area of interest for me, particularly, but I think we've begun to see it in Colorado and New Mexico, where communities are including in CWPPs some conversation or recommendations around immediate post-fire issues like flooding, or more long-term issues like how do we think about reforestation if there is a fire, even, you know, essentially if the CWPP isn't as effective as we hope. Was that anything you saw?
Yeah, I think so. Certainly that came out a lot in the focus groups as something that is really critical moving forward. You know, I think everyone's looking to these fires in California and the importance of post-fire planning. We've also had post-fire flooding events in Arizona, especially around the Flagstaff area, that have been sort of catastrophic. And so, yeah, that was a really common theme as far as looking at how specifically the use of post-fire planning has changed in Arizona plans over time. We did not do that, but that was a recommendation that plans should certainly contain that post-fire planning emphasis. And then I think what we've seen in Arizona is that, again, there's a range of approaches to doing that. So for example, in Flagstaff, there's a tie-in from the CWPP to the Flagstaff Watershed Protection Project, which is to address post-fire flooding from the Schultz fire and help, stop potential post-fire flooding in the future. But yeah, that's certainly an element of CWPPs that there's a growing interest in that I heard.
Great, thank you. Other questions out there? Let's see. David has put in a question about, I'll just go ahead and read it. The Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network framework includes public health. Have you surveyed any plans that include a section in the CWPP relating to smoke or other public health issues?
We did not look at detail in at smoke and public health. Again, that was sort of another leg of the stool of a fire adapted community. Some plans get into some detail on it and others don't mention it at all, but that wasn't a specific element that we looked at in detail on this project. So I'm sorry I can't answer more about that.
Yeah, no, it's understandable. You looked at a lot of plans. Well, we'll wait just another minute here. Sometimes it takes a second for people to type stuff in. I guess I had sort of as you're talking about the audience, I was thinking about CWPPs we've participated in here in New Mexico, and the challenges with that audience question is there are really multiple audiences, which I'm sure it's part of your thinking on it. But do you have any thoughts about how to deal with the fact that CWPP is a real generalist document and is trying to be a lot of things to a lot of different audiences? And how do you handle that given your recommendation to be clear about audience?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we do see that the CWPPs are often trying to do a lot of things at once. Some do that more successfully than others, I think. But what one of the focus groups talked about, you could even at the beginning of each section of a CWPP have a sort of executive summary of sorts that's for, identifying the different audiences, potential audiences of a plan, and then each section could have a brief executive summary of what the key messages are for those different audiences. So say we had two, like our agency audience and then maybe a public audience. Another option would be to have sort of an agency audience plan and then some specific public facing pieces of it. So there are different ways that it was recommended that could be addressed. It's not to say that a CWPP can't be an interagency document and also have a public-facing side. Some plans in Arizona, for example, Yavapai County is looking at doing this, having a story map, and then there are other places in the West that do this already. That's more of a public-facing element, and that then the plan, the PDF sort of meaty document itself is more for the agencies.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a neat way to serve more than one audience. Got a couple questions come in here. Sam Barry asks whether the recommendations that you showed in the presentation are available already as a white paper or a report or handout or something. I know you mentioned that the final thing coming soon, maybe next month, but is there anything we can point people to today?
Great question. We do not yet have a white paper or a report available. As I mentioned, that will be finished by the end of December, and I'd be happy to share it out when it is final.
Great, great.
We will have both a white paper, or I guess a report, and then a fact sheet.
Okay, good. And well, that's the sort of thing that we'll share out via the Southwest Fire Science Consortium, so that'll be great.
Great.
Molly, thank you for a good webinar, and then asked whether you encountered any feedback or guidance on plan linkages. That is to say, such as how to best connect a CWPP to a local hazard mitigation plan, a comprehensive general plan, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think I'm still struggling with how to best provide guidance on that. Sort of continuing to explore the ways that that's been done in other entities. And so I think, with respect to this question, so if we're thinking about it from the angle of scale, and we have plans that are at the state scale, such as this shared stewardship agreement, plans at the county scale, such as a county hazard mitigation plan, and also potentially a CWPP. I think there's ways in which those scales can acknowledge each other and think about, what level of detail is important to have at each of those scales. What's the level of detail that we would want to see in a FireWise plan? What's the level of detail that we want to see in a CWPP? And then, sort of scaling up to the state scale, and then making sure there's some overlap, but also that they're working together in concert. So that's kind of one way I've been thinking about it, is what details do we want to see at what scale, but we're still working on sort of lining that out. But that's a great question. It's very important moving forward.
Yeah, and I'll also mention that there's been some good work trying to draw the connections between CWPPs and FEMA mitigation plans. I'm
Yep.
not sure. I know FEMA had some PowerPoints. I'm not sure if I could put my hand on them, but maybe a little Googling would turn them up as sort of the connection between those two.
Yep.
Some other comments came in. Eitan said, I like the suggestion of the story map. He's also been part of plans to do a magazine type 7 to 10 page summary for general consumption. Be more the print version of the story map.
Yep.
Chris asks whether in your discussions with other states you were able to determine the sources for data used in the risk assessment process. For example, West-wide risk assessments or a localized process.
Yeah, that's a great question as well. It varies. So we see in some states that they sort of require the use of West-wide risk assessment or RAPS. Other places have more specific guidance on, risk assessment tools that are available or even provide data. It just ranges. Again, we've kind of got across the board from no guidance at all to requiring the use of a local state or West-wide risk assessment outputs.
Yeah, a lot of variation out there. Cheryl did a better job than I did on remembering the FEMA connection that I was sort of hinting at. FEMA Region 10 has done some work on connecting CWPPs and hazard mitigation plans. Thank you, Cheryl, for filling in where I was not on the ball.
Great. Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
And we're at the top of the hour, so unless a question comes in fast, I think we should wrap up here. Thank you again. That was a really good presentation. Really, I appreciate your willingness to sort of share some of these insights, even before the project is fully completed. It's great. I think there are probably people out there working on CWPPs right now that will be able to use this. So really good timing. And we'll look forward to the final results. So thank you so much for your presentation, Melanie, and thanks everybody for participating. And well, I'll close off the webinar now.
Great. Thank you so much. It was good to join you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.